London, England, February 1942. In a cramped basement office beneath the Ministry of Information, 17-year-old Margaret Davies sat at a battered wooden desk, her fingers stained with ink, as she catalogued what her supervisor dismissively called the most meaningless assignment in British intelligence. While codebreakers at Bletchley Park wrestled with encrypted German communications and field agents risked their lives across occupied Europe, Margaret's job was to read letters. Hundreds of them. Letters from lonely soldiers, worried mothers, anxious sweethearts. All completely harmless, all utterly boring. Or so everyone believed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What no one could have imagined was that this seemingly pointless task, assigned to keep a young girl out of the way, would expose one of the most sophisticated espionage operations targeting Britain during the war. And it would all come down to something so trivial that even Margaret herself almost missed it. Margaret had been assigned to the Postal Censorship Division 3 months earlier, shortly after her 17th birthday. The daughter of a postal worker from Cardiff, she had arrived in London with dreams of contributing to the conflict effort, perhaps as a nurse or factory worker. Instead, she found herself reading other people's mail. Her supervisor, a perpetually exhausted woman named Mrs. Eleanor Hartwick, had explained the job with barely concealed apathy. They were to watch for obvious security breaches. Soldiers mentioning troop movements, civilians discussing factory production, anything that could aid the enemy if intercepted. In 3 months, Margaret had found exactly 2 letters worth flagging, one from a drunken sailor who had mentioned his ship's name, and another from a factory worker who had complained about making parts for a specific aircraft model. Both had been minor infractions, earning stern warnings for their authors, and no recognition whatsoever for Margaret. The work was mind-numbing. Each morning, she would arrive at 7 o'clock to find a new canvas bag, filled with letters, sorted randomly from various post offices across southern England. She would read each one, make brief notes, stamp them as approved, and move them to the outgoing pile. By 5 o'clock in the evening, her eyes ached, her back hurt, and she had learned far more about strangers' personal lives than she ever wanted to know. Mrs. Hartwick told her she was lucky to have such safe work, that thousands of young women would gladly trade places with her. Margaret tried to feel grateful. She mostly felt useless. But Margaret had one habit that separated her from the 3 other girls who worked in the postal censorship basement. She remembered things. Not just the content of flagged letters, but patterns. The way certain people wrote, common phrases, regional expressions. Her father had always marveled at her memory for details. During her childhood in Cardiff, she could recall the exact words of conversations from weeks earlier, remember which neighbour had said what at the Sunday market, identify handwriting she had seen only once before. Her teachers had called it a peculiar talent. Here, reading hundreds of letters each week, that peculiar talent began to manifest in an unexpected way. In early March, Margaret read a letter from a woman in Portsmouth to her sister in Birmingham. The letter was unremarkable. The woman, who signed herself as Dorothy, discussed rationing difficulties, complained about the weather, and asked about her sister's children. The writing was neat, the tone affectionate. Margaret stamped it and moved on. 2 weeks later, another letter from Dorothy appeared. Same addressee, same general topics. Margaret paused. Something felt off. She pulled out her notebook where she kept brief records of letters she had processed. She found her entry for the first Dorothy letter. Same handwriting, same return address, but different paper. The first letter had been on standard cream-colored stationery. This one was slightly whiter, with a faint blue tint. Probably nothing. People ran out of paper, used whatever they could find. Margaret stamped the second letter. 3 weeks later, a third Dorothy letter arrived. Margaret's instinct, that nagging sense of pattern recognition, made her pause again. She retrieved the previous 2 entries from her notebook. This time she noticed something else. The handwriting was identical. Perfectly identical. Not similar, not close. Exactly the same. Each letter of each word matched its predecessor with precision that seemed almost mechanical. Margaret had read thousands of letters by this point. She knew that handwriting varied. People wrote differently when rushed, when tired, when emotional. Even the most consistent writers showed tiny variations. Pressure on certain letters, spacing, slant. These 3 letters showed none of that natural variation. She brought her observation to Mrs. Hartwick, who barely looked up from her own pile of correspondence. The older woman sighed with the weariness of someone who had heard countless false alarms from overeager young assistants. She told Margaret that consistency in handwriting was not suspicious, that perhaps this Dorothy simply had very neat penmanship, and that Margaret should focus on actual security concerns rather than trivial details about paper quality and letter formation. Margaret returned to her desk, feeling foolish. Perhaps Mrs. Hartwick was right. Perhaps she was making something out of nothing. But the feeling would not leave her alone. That evening, instead of going straight to the boarding house where she rented a small room with 2 other young women, Margaret stopped by the public library. She asked the librarian, a kind older man named Mr. Pemberton, if she could see books on handwriting analysis. He seemed surprised by the request, but directed her to a small section on graphology and forensic document examination. Margaret checked out 2 books and spent the night reading by candlelight after her roommates had fallen asleep. The books confirmed her suspicion. Truly identical handwriting across multiple documents suggested either mechanical reproduction, which was unlikely for personal letters, or something more deliberate. A person attempting to forge consistency, perhaps copying from a template. The books also discussed something called a null cipher, where the real message was hidden within an innocent-seeming letter using predetermined patterns, specific words at specific intervals, first letters of sentences, spacing irregularities. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. Could Dorothy's letters contain hidden information? The next morning, she arrived at work an hour early. She had copied down the full text of all 3 Dorothy letters into her notebook the previous evening. Now, sitting alone in the basement office, she began to analyze them methodically. She tried reading every 3rd word. Nothing coherent. Every 5th word. Nonsense. First letter of each sentence. Random. She tried diagonal readings, numerical patterns, biblical cipher methods described in the books. Nothing worked. By the time Mrs. Hartwick arrived, Margaret had convinced herself she was chasing shadows. The older woman noticed her early presence and made a pointed comment about excessive enthusiasm being no substitute for actual results. 2 months passed. Margaret continued her work with a growing sense of resignation. She processed hundreds more letters. She flagged 3 minor security violations. She watched the calendar pages turn as spring arrived in London, bringing slightly warmer weather and continued anxiety about the conflict. The Dorothy letters continued to appear, roughly every 2 to 3 weeks. Margaret noted each one in her records but stopped bringing them to Mrs. Hartwick's attention. She continued to feel that nagging sense that something was wrong, but without proof there was nothing she could do. In late May, Margaret developed a terrible head cold. Her nose ran constantly, her eyes watered, and she could barely focus on the words she was reading. Mrs. Hartwick insisted she continue working, reminding her that the postal service did not stop for minor illnesses. Margaret struggled through her morning pile of letters, squinting through watery eyes, wiping her nose with a handkerchief every few minutes. Around 11 o'clock, another Dorothy letter appeared in her stack. Frustrated, sick, and thoroughly tired of these mysterious letters that no one else cared about, Margaret made an impulsive decision. Instead of just reading it, she held it up to the light fixture above her desk to check if anything was visible through the paper. What she saw made her forget about her cold entirely. Faint marks, barely visible, not writing exactly, but tiny pinpricks. Holes punched through the paper at specific points beneath certain letters. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She pulled out her records and retrieved the dates when previous Dorothy letters had arrived. She rushed to the archive room, where processed letters were stored for 30 days before being sent to their destinations. She found the 2 most recent Dorothy letters and brought them back to her desk. She held each one up to the light. Pinpricks. In the same pattern of placement relative to the text, but marking different letters in each correspondence. Her heart was pounding now. This was deliberate. This was coded. This was exactly what she had suspected. But why the pinpricks? What did they mean? She stared at the 3 letters spread across her desk, looking at which letters were marked. In the most recent letter, the marks appeared beneath the letters B-R-I-S-T-O-L. Spread across the first paragraph. Bristol, a city, a location. She checked the second letter. The marked letters spelled P-O-R-T-S-M-O-U-T-H, Portsmouth, another city. The third letter, the oldest one she had retrieved, spelled C-O-V-E-N-T-R-Y, Coventry. Margaret felt cold despite her fever. These were not random cities. Bristol had been struck during a series of attacks the week after the first letter was sent. Portsmouth had experienced significant targeting around the time of the second letter. Coventry had been devastated months earlier, but German operations had targeted it repeatedly since then. Someone was passing information about potential targets, and they were using the postal system, passing right through censorship, because the real message was invisible unless you specifically looked for it. This time, Margaret did not go to Mrs. Hartwick. She went directly to the division head, a stern man named Colonel Patterson, who worked 2 floors above them and whom Margaret had never actually spoken to before. His secretary tried to turn her away, but Margaret insisted, her voice shaking but determined. She had evidence of espionage. She needed to speak with the colonel immediately. The secretary, perhaps sensing genuine urgency, reluctantly allowed her into Patterson's office. Colonel Patterson listened to Margaret's explanation with an expression that shifted from irritation to interest to intense focus. He examined the letters himself, holding them to the light, seeing the pinpricks that had been invisible to everyone who had simply read the surface content. He asked Margaret precise questions. How many letters had there been? When had they arrived? Where were they sent from and to? Margaret provided every detail from her meticulous records. Patterson picked up his telephone and made 3 calls in rapid succession, speaking in terse military language that Margaret could not entirely follow. Within 2 hours, Margaret found herself in a completely different building, a nondescript office in Westminster that bore no external markings. She was interviewed by 2 men who introduced themselves only as Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, names so obviously false that they did not bother pretending otherwise. They went through everything again, every observation, every date, every detail. They examined her notebooks, asked her to explain her analysis methods, questioned her about what had made her suspicious in the first place. Margaret explained about the identical handwriting, the pattern recognition, the feeling that something was wrong even when she could not prove it. The men listened without expression. Then Mr. Smith asked her a question that made her realize how serious this had become. He asked if she had told anyone else about her suspicions, anyone at all. Friends, family, roommates. Margaret said no. She had barely been able to convince her own supervisor to listen. She had told no one else because she had nothing concrete to tell. Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones exchanged looks. Mr. Jones left the room. Mr. Smith told Margaret that she had stumbled onto something significant. The letters would be traced, the recipients investigated, the operation monitored. And Margaret was to tell absolutely no one what she had discovered. She was to continue her work exactly as before. If more Dorothy letters appeared, she was to note them privately and report directly to this office. She was given a telephone number to memorize, not write down. She was told that her observation skills had potentially saved lives. Then she was sent back to her regular office with instructions to act as though nothing had happened. The following weeks were torture. Margaret returned to reading letters, but now every moment felt weighted with significance. She jumped every time the phone rang. She studied each letter with obsessive attention, looking for more pinpricks, more codes, more suspicious patterns. Mrs. Hartwick noticed her distraction and scolded her for declining quality of work. Margaret could not explain. She could not defend herself. She simply nodded and tried to focus. 3 weeks after her meeting with Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, 2 more letters arrived on the same day, both allegedly from Dorothy, both with pinpricks. Margaret's hands shook as she recorded them. She called the number she had memorized. A woman's voice answered with a simple yes. Margaret identified herself using the code phrase she had been given. She reported the new letters. The voice thanked her and disconnected. That was all. No explanation, no update, nothing. Margaret learned later, much later, what her discovery had set in motion. The letters were indeed being sent by a German operative, but not from Portsmouth as the return address claimed. The enemy intelligence service had established a sophisticated network that collected information from various sources across southern England. Sympathizers, paid informants, people with access to military installations or industrial facilities. That information was compiled and needed to be transmitted back to German controllers. Direct radio transmission was too risky. Dead drops could be compromised. But the postal system, with thousands of letters moving daily, provided perfect camouflage. The operative, whose real name was Anna Wolf, had been trained in Berlin in a technique called steganography, the hidden message in the pinpricks. The letters were actually being sent from London with false Portsmouth addresses added. A Confederate in Birmingham. The woman receiving the letters would decode the pinpricks, compile the intelligence and pass it to a radio operator who transmitted it during brief, irregular broadcasts that British monitors had detected but never located. The identical handwriting was achieved through careful tracing, using a light table to copy a master template onto each new letter. The varying paper was a mistake, an oversight that Anna had not realized would be noticeable. But without Margaret's exceptional memory and attention to detail, that small variation would never have been caught. British counterintelligence, once alerted, moved carefully. They did not immediately arrest anyone. Instead, they watched. They traced the network. They identified the Birmingham recipient, a woman named Helen Marsh, who worked at a factory producing aircraft components. They followed Helen and discovered the radio operator, a man calling himself Thomas Wright, who lived in a boarding house in Coventry. They monitored the transmissions, began feeding false information through the network, setting up a counterintelligence operation that would eventually compromise German intelligence gathering across the entire region. The decision was made to let the network continue operating for several months, now under British control. Anna Wolf continued sending her Dorothy letters, unaware that each one was being immediately intercepted, decoded, and replaced with doctored versions that contained deliberately misleading information. The Germans received intelligence that seemed credible, that came from their trusted source, but that was carefully crafted to support British deception efforts. When a major operation was being planned for the North African campaign in autumn 1942, the Dorothy letters were used to convince German commanders that the primary thrust would come from a completely different direction. Resources were diverted, defenses were positioned incorrectly, lives were saved because the enemy was looking in the wrong place. Margaret knew none of this as it was happening. She continued her work in the basement, reading letters, noting anything suspicious, making her reports through the secure telephone line. She was told nothing about the larger operation. She saw no results from her discovery. The recognition she had dreamed of, the sense of contributing meaningfully, remained absent. Mrs. Hartwick still treated her as a somewhat overzealous girl with too much imagination. Her roommates thought she worked in routine postal administration. Boring and insignificant. Margaret began to wonder if her discovery had mattered at all, or if Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones had simply humored her before dismissing her observations as the coincidental findings of an overactive mind. In November 1942, 9 months after Margaret had first noticed the identical handwriting, she received an unusual summons. She was to report to Colonel Patterson's office, not for a brief meeting but for a formal appointment. When she arrived, she found not only Patterson, but 3 other senior officers, 2 men in civilian clothes who had the bearing of intelligence officials, and to her complete shock, a woman in the uniform of the Women's Royal Naval Service, whom Margaret recognized from newspaper photographs. Dame Vera Atkins, one of the most respected figures in British intelligence operations. Colonel Patterson invited Margaret to sit. Then he told her something that would change her understanding of the previous 9 months entirely. The spy network she had discovered had been completely compromised. 12 individuals had been quietly detained over the past weeks. The radio operator had been turned, now working for British intelligence. The entire operation had been flipped, becoming one of the most successful counterintelligence achievements of the conflict so far. false information passed through the Dorothy letters had contributed to operational successes in North Africa that had saved an estimated several thousand Allied lives. And it had all begun with a 17-year-old girl noticing that someone used different paper and had unusually consistent handwriting. Dame Vera spoke directly to Margaret. She explained that intelligence work was often like this, small observations leading to large consequences, patience and attention to detail mattering more than dramatic action. She told Margaret that her work had been exceptional, that her instincts had been correct, and that Britain was grateful for her service. Then she offered Margaret something that seemed impossible, a position with the Special Operations Executive, with proper training, with real responsibility. The conflict needed people who could see patterns, who paid attention, who did not dismiss their own observations even when others doubted them. People exactly like Margaret Davies. Margaret accepted. She spent the next 2 years working in intelligence analysis, first in London and later in liberated France, identifying patterns in enemy communications, tracking supply movements, contributing to operations that she would not be allowed to discuss for decades afterward. She never forgot that it had all started with a trivial detail that everyone else had ignored: the different paper, the too perfect handwriting, the nagging feeling that something was not quite right. After the conflict ended in 1945, Margaret remained in government service for several years before eventually returning to Wales, where she married a teacher named Robert Hughes and raised 3 children. She rarely spoke about her contributions during the conflict, bound by secrecy agreements and by the natural modesty of her generation. Her children knew vaguely that their mother had worked for the government during those years, doing something with letters, but they did not understand the significance. It was not until the 1980s, when various intelligence files began to be declassified, that the full story of the Dorothy letter network emerged. Historians researching British counterintelligence operations during the conflict found references to a young postal censor whose observations had broken open a significant spy ring. They traced the story, requested additional file releases, and eventually identified Margaret by then Margaret Hughes living quietly in Cardiff. A researcher from the Imperial War Museum contacted her, asking for an interview. Margaret, then in her 50s, agreed to speak on the condition that the focus would be on the work itself, not on her personally. During that interview, recorded and now held in the museum's archives, Margaret was asked what had made her persist when her supervisor had dismissed her concerns, when the evidence was so subtle, when she had no proof. She thought for a long moment before answering. She said that her father had taught her that the small things mattered, that paying attention was a form of respect for the world around you, that patterns existed whether people noticed them or not. She had simply been doing what seemed natural to her, remembering what she saw, trusting her own observations, even when others did not. The interviewer asked if she felt proud of what she had accomplished. Margaret's answer was characteristically modest. She said that many people had done far more dangerous and important work during those years. She had been safe in a basement office, while others risked their lives. But yes, she supposed she was proud that she had paid attention, that she had trusted herself, that something she had noticed had mattered. The small trick of holding a letter up to the light, the supposedly pointless task of remembering details no one else thought were important. The full scope of what Margaret's discovery had prevented took decades to fully document. The German intelligence network she had exposed was part of a larger operation that had been gathering information on British industrial production, military deployments, and strategic planning. The false information fed back through the compromised network had contributed not only to the North African operations, but to deception efforts around the eventual Allied operations in northwestern Europe in 1944. Intelligence assessments conducted years later estimated that the turned network had contributed to operational advantages that affected multiple major campaigns. Anna Wolf, the German operative who had created the Dorothy letters, was detained in a quiet operation in late 1942. She was held in a secure facility and interrogated extensively. She never learned that her network had been compromised because of a teenager who noticed her handwriting was too perfect and her stationery was inconsistent. After the conflict, she was repatriated to Germany as part of prisoner exchanges. Her intelligence career ended, her sophisticated technique undone by the smallest of details. Margaret passed away in 2006 at the age of 81. Her obituary in the local Cardiff newspaper made brief mention of her government service during the 1940s, but most readers would not have understood its significance. Her children, going through her belongings, found her old notebooks from the postal censorship days, the meticulous records she had kept of patterns and observations. They donated them to the Imperial War Museum, where they remain as testimony to how intelligence work actually happens, not always through dramatic confrontations or daring espionage, but sometimes through patience, attention, and the willingness to trust that small details matter. The lesson of Margaret Davies and the Dorothy letters has been taught at intelligence training facilities ever since the story was declassified. Instructors use it to emphasize the importance of paying attention to inconsistencies, of trusting analytical instincts, of understanding that the most sophisticated operations can be undone by the smallest oversight. They teach that memory matters, that pattern recognition is a skill, that the young woman assigned to the supposedly pointless task might be the one who sees what everyone else misses. In the basement of the building that once housed the Postal Censorship Division, now converted to commercial offices, there is a small brass plaque that few people notice. It was placed there in 1998 by the British Intelligence Service's Historical Committee. The plaque reads simply, "In recognition of the postal censors who served here during the Second World War, whose attention to detail contributed to the security of the nation. Particular recognition to Margaret Davies, whose observations in 1942 led to the compromise of enemy intelligence operations. Small details, large consequences, and that concludes our story." If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.